Well, welcome to this next recap for life group discussion. Each time we've tried to do a quick summary of where we got up to, and let's just do that quickly as we run through Isaiah 61 up to the point of verse 7 where I got up to a couple of weeks ago. We've been saying each time who the Anointed One is. Obviously, in the end, it's Jesus. Then the passage talks about why he had come, to bring good news to the poor. And then it talks in lots of terms about what that means in practice, and then ends up talking in three insteads about the transformation that he's going to bring. And then he talks about the new identity that his people are going to have when it talks about you'll be oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. And then in verse 4, there's a rebuilding to do. Rebuild, restore, renew. And then we get to verses 5 to 7, which I spoke on a couple of weeks ago. There's quite a lot to work out in that passage, what's going on. But there are three sort of themes, really. One is strangers and foreigners. Second one is priests. And the third one is inheritance. So strangers and foreigners, the passage talks about how strangers will tend your flocks and work your vineyards. Now, what it's not saying is that having been oppressed by other nations, that Israel will now oppress the other nations and put them to menial tasks, which those were. What it's saying really is that there'll be an inclusion, that having been a separated nation who always were meant to be a witness to God, that there'll be a welcoming in of the other nations to participate really in the life of God at work in his people, which of course is our calling too. We are here to be a witness. We're here not to stay separate, like a little Christian ghetto. The idea is, of course, that we are a blessing to the nations, a blessing to your neighbours, a blessing to your work colleagues. And I mentioned a couple of stories of people in Torquay who I knew who had become Christians. And I wonder who it is that God is putting you near. Maybe it's a work colleague, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a neighbour or someone in a social setting. I wonder who God's putting you near, where you can be a bit of a bridge to help them get to know something of the life of God, to demonstrate something of what it is to have God in your life. It would be good to take a few minutes to stop and think about who that is for you, and to pray and maybe even decide what the next steps might be for you to take in helping people on that journey. And then priests. So the passage talks about God saying to his people that you will be priests, you will be ministers, servants to the Lord. Well, of course, that wasn't a new thing, because way back in the Old Testament, the people were called to be a kingdom of priests. That's what God had wanted them always to be, that they would always serve him, they would always live for him. And though they were a tribe, the Levites, who were specially called out to be priests, here they're all being called to be priests, which of course is a theme the New Testament picks up. Peter specifically picks up these phrases and says to us that we are to be a kingdom of priests, the inheritance of God, that we're his people, his special chosen royal priesthood, which reminds us, of course, that we, all of us, are serving the Lord all the time in his presence, as priests would do. And I talked about Brother Lawrence, amazing guy from the 17th century in France, who spent the first 10 years of his time in the monastery totally depressed, which I think is reasonably understandable, and then had this experience of God, encounter with God, and the whole thing changed for him. And from that moment on, he knew what it was to live in the presence of God, cultivating, practicing, he called it, the presence of God all the time. So whether he was in the kitchen, which is where he worked, serving the monastery, whether he was in the kitchen peeling potatoes or on his knees in prayer, it didn't really matter to him. He was always in the presence of God. A great illustration of being a priest, of being all the time, wherever any of us are as followers of Jesus, serving the Lord. And then we moved on to talk about inheritance. Well, in the passage and in the context of Israel back in those days, inheritance really was to do with land, and the father would, a father would leave his land to his sons. Well, obviously, it's not land for us that we inherit, but inheritance is a really big biblical theme, a very big New Testament theme. And of course, for us, it's not land, it's actually God himself. So you get to the end of Revelation and you have that amazing passage in chapter 21, which talks about that there will be no more crying or dying or pain any longer in our eternal inheritance. But the verse before it, verse 3 in Revelation 21, says that the Lord God will be with his people and his people will be with him. And the inheritance, way back, just linking back to the Levites in the Old Testament, their inheritance, they didn't have a land inheritance, because the passage tells us back in Leviticus, tells us that the Lord is their inheritance. The magnificent thing for the Christian is not that we get this or we get that, though we are blessed in so many ways, but ultimately the prize, if you like, our inheritance is God himself. It's absolutely extraordinary that God has given us himself. We will enjoy him forever, be forever in his presence, serving him, loving him, enjoying him. He is our inheritance. It's extraordinary message, this gospel, isn't it, that finishes on that glorious note.